circles of justice that you're thinking about that, you know, white men specifically would, you know, kind of be appropriate to be invited rather than being sort of inserting oneself into it, which I really appreciate that sentiment. But it made me think of, and I also really appreciated your implicating the sort of nonprofit industrial complex and private philanthropy. I think that's politically really central to our challenge right now. And I worked in the nonprofit industrial complex for a while as a nonprofit executive director, and I had many politically formative experiences, but one of them was meeting Ariane de Rothschild, who is a grand dame of philanthropy, and the Rothschilds are very clever. They managed to never get on the big Fortune 500, rather the like 100 richest people, good financial managers. And it was very surreal. Like, I met her on the penthouse floor of the Ford Foundation, and she wasn't on the agenda. She like choppered in and like came in. It was clearly like the queen bee of philanthropy had arrived. I think Ariane de Rothschild, likewise, though she is not a man, should not insert herself in the kinds of circles that you're describing. So how do we think about class stratification? You know, that it's you know, you have obviously dynamics of power operating across racial lines, across sex lines, but it seems like class is sometimes missed. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that.
One last question. Yeah. No, we can start with Dr. Right.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for the question. I kind of regard Oryx and Craig as a self-contained unit that was then added to later. So my argument is specifically about that book. Nevertheless, of course, it gets relativized, I guess, by book 2 and book 3 in the trilogy. And what strikes me is that the God's Gardeners are, of course, unsuccessful. I think that there's an element of that already in Oryx and Craig, because Jimmy's mother runs off to become an eco-terrorist and then may or may not be killed by the corporate police. I don't think that's ever really made clear because Jimmy doesn't know. And of course that's an interesting element of resistance, which then the second book builds on. And I think you again have this ambiguity within the entire trilogy of what would happen if Craig didn't destroy humanity. Would this eco-terrorist group maybe find an alternative? We don't know, because the end, they predict the end and the end comes. I guess the book would be skeptic, especially with the third book then, and Mad Adam, and him not being exactly the nicest person. So I don't know. I guess that the entire trilogy, as well as Oryx and Craig, is just, there runs this deep ambiguity through it and this deep distrust of kind of what the second question was about, charismatic leaders and people telling us this is how we should do things, this is how to liberate the world. In book 1 it's Craig, in book 2 it's several characters in the God's Gardeners, and in book 3 it's of course Mad Adam.
I don't use that word. So I think, you know, I have a chapter on the social, and in that chapter I try to explore our experiences of the social. How do we experience it? And you know, if you're doing I mean, I've been a consultant in organizations doing ethics and diversity and stuff, and there we would use something like the diversity wheel, right, to talk about the experiences of the social. And then you can go down to like social conflict, riots and wars, right, between social groups. But I'm more interested today in social amnesia. That people, and a lot of people I would see as potential readers, have no are totally ignorant of class or their social position. So I look at the social always in terms of social relations, so that you don't have isolated social groups where you say, well, what's that relationship look like between white males and black males, right? What's the relationship look like in terms of more black males are incarcerated today than were enslaved? I mean, what does that look like, right? So that's part of it. The other part is the focus on broken relationships and how do you repair them? And I think you have to do that to create this climate of justice. And so I'm not sure what that entails, but I think as belonging to a white male group, you know, I'm part of a group that has to listen and say, what should we do about this? How can we restore trust? How can we work together in designing a city that is for all of us? Does that answer the question?
Yeah, there are several interesting things in there for sure.
Do we have another question?
This is for Joshua. Thanks for a great talk. And I'm endlessly vexed by this question of V-state because, of course, there is no V-state. So what is it really that we're talking about? And I'm thinking about the history of slavery and sugar, and ultimately, by the time the Portuguese get to Brazil, I know that you know all this, the operative principle is just war. And in the recruitment and enslaving of indigenous peoples, that and so my riff always was that the principle of just war ultimately becomes just war as the operation of the colonial state in that context. I'm wondering, and I don't have an answer that I'm fishing for, if we take seriously a world ecological argument, then the colonial state in these sugar zones is shaped decisively by the need to find and reproduce cheap racialized labor, and by something about the geographical, biophysical particularities of the production regime itself. And I'm wondering if you could maybe just speak to that or reflect on that.
Is there more questions?
It's 6:57. We can get another question. Does anybody have a question?
Hopefully I'll say something shocking enough that someone will just have to respond. So I think the question of the state is always sort of is a difficult one, or in a lot of ways we sort of end up thinking about it as a noun rather than as a relation. And the same way of like capital is value in motion. What is the state in motion? What is racialization in motion? And I think it's about sort of reconstructing those networks. So it's sort of like you have clearly sort of centers of monarchical power in Lisbon that have their dictates, they have their local, they have sort of their local agents, and there's always sort of the question of what appears in the archive, what doesn't appear in the archive, and what is it hinting at, what can it not say? And for this period in particular, and for this place in particular, the archives are pretty slim, unfortunately. But in some ways, I think the most productive ways is we sort of trying to think about state effects as process and how they articulate sort of through processes of capital accumulation. The two things I come back to over and over again are violence and basically sort of subjects, sort of the production of subjects, which is not to say people are defined by the multiple contrary systems of the way that we are produced as gendered subjects, as racialized subjects, as class subjects. but what sort of categories are we trying to be slotted into? And so in this case, sort of the articulation of the plantation has very understandable ideas. In Brazil, it's, you know, basically the plantation infrastructure is built on sort of the enslavement of the indigenous of South America, all the way sort of as late as 1600, and is not till latest till 1650 until that transformation is complete. At the same time, who is actually building, controlling that violence is a series of chains, which, again, as we sort of think about those chains of subjects, of subjectivities, are also, therefore, abstractions. And sort of, there's been some really great work on the role of abstraction in sort of the slave trade, because, again, sort of thinking about the absences of the archive, there are very, very few names. When you look at the records of the slave trade, what appears is numbers and the names of the owners. And that's what and then there's basically lists of the costs of running a business. What does the food cost? You know, where did you dock? And that's about it. On the other hand, when you look at things like notary records, the slaves are given names. They're clearly sort of within they're Christian subjects at that point. And I think it's in some ways, and I don't necessarily feel like this is a satisfactory answer, but it's about, that seems to me that's the process of historical reconstruction. It's sort of thinking about sort of violence and subjects. Because again, the easiest way to avoid the violence and the ability of being turned into a certain type of subject is to flee, which is, and sort of a maroon, people sort of stretch to sort of thinking about maroon ecologies, or perhaps beyond maroon ecologies.
It's 4 o'clock, so maybe we have one final question, quick question and answer, or if not, we can, like Christian said earlier, do informally afterwards.
I can ask a question. A question open to all three presenters, because I think it can fit in many, yeah, it can fit kind of everywhere. I'm working on border studies, I don't know, very broad, and just immigration in general. I'm just trying to understand, how do you think, what's the role of the state? That's kind of picking on what Jason was saying. How do you view the role of the state in facilitating this reparation project and creating these spaces of communality and new society, new civil meetings where people with the new civilian, or this new redefinition of civilian, like you were saying, can meet? So what's the role of the state in this? And if, can we, how are these processes of capital accumulation shifting the cheap labor in context of immigration? And like, can we look at these movements of cheap labor as a similar form of slavery? I mean, a similar form of plantation, in the formation of detention centers and prison industrial complex.
You know, in terms of the border, for me, one of the big disappointments is the United Nations should be on our southern border protecting civilians, right? I mean, 90% of peacekeepers today from the United Nations are protecting civilians. And what we have in the border is no one's protecting civilians. And we don't have, so the way you protect civilians, so the only way, the main way it happens is you have to pressure government into doing that. And that's not happening either, right? So then I think there are laws that could be applied to that situation, but they're not, and instead, you have things that are horrendous happening. The separation of children from families. That's illegal. It's not only immoral, it's illegal, right? But we don't have someone doing, or us, myself, doing pressure to have the state enforce those laws. I think the rule of law has some potential. That's, yeah.
the short answer is yes, and the long answer is yes, and the rest of this. I think it's sort of I think it's absolutely a story of cheap labor, and I don't necessarily get into it in this talk, but what the slave trade really is in many ways is sort of the spatialization of generational reproductive labor. And it's sort of basically every person who gets marched onto a slave ship is somebody who whatever sort of capital ends up buying them did not have to pay for their reproduction. And so I think it's important to sort of think about one, sort of the different capitals in competition, so who's actually paying for that reproduction. It's also, again, you can't disarticulate the border question with everything else, sort of the rest of the political economy of the hemisphere. I mean, just the absolute sort of decimation of what's happened in Central America, but also the fact that the flow of, immigrants, but really flow of the working class from Mexico to the United States slowed down, not because of change in the border regime, but because of the slowdown in the housing construction. And so those two things are sort of inevitably linked. And I think that one of the fascinating things that we've sort of seen with the sort of current political moment that we're in is that sort of the fevered right-wing imaginary of the 1990s and all the way through, and I'll sort of wrap this up, was basically about this, the one world government was going to put Americans in camps, and this was, FEMA was going to take over everything. And in fact, when the sort of sees most branches of the government, that's what they start doing, is start putting members of the working class in camps. And so basically everything the right wing says it's afraid of, that's probably its program for the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to all the presenters, and yeah, I think that's probably it for today.
Thank you.
Bright early tomorrow morning.